First, I think we'd like to start by telling you who we are, the people who put this together. We, the People of Ohio Valley, is a nonprofit educational organization, and we're sponsoring this forum because we think people need to understand what's going on with our First Amendment and the Constitution. We believe the Constitution provides for God-given, unalienable rights for every American citizen. Our mission is to be a public service organization to educate the public in Ohio, West Virginia, as well as neighboring states, and we do travel out of state. And our mission is to increase awareness, comprehension of, and devotion to the principles upon which this nation was founded, and to the principles of good citizenship. Our core values that guide us: uphold the Constitution of the United States, support free markets, limited government, fiscal responsibility, and holding elected officials accountable. We believe that's all of our jobs. So for those who are following the Tea Party, we had a little note, a little bit of trivia note, that yesterday was 3 years since the Tea Parties got started. There were 53 of them to begin with, and now there are thousands of them all over the country. So now let's get started. One thing you need to understand is without engaged citizens like you who were willing to come out, we would have lost liberty a long time ago. So why are we here today? I had to ask myself that question, and what I came up with was Ronald Reagan's words came back to me, sort of told me, I don't know if he was speaking to me or what, but this is what he said, quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children through the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them so they can do the same. One day, we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like to be in America when men were free." I think those words are pretty potent today, as they were when he said them. Now, our founding fathers knew very well at the beginning that we had to have people to be truly free as God intended, and that people would have to be vigilant in defending their freedom and liberty in every generation. And many of them made those statements. In our generation, we're now seeing the hand of tyranny reach into our spiritual life in an unprecedented way. Our presentation tonight will have 3 speakers. Each will have a separate thing to talk about. All will be clarifying the perspective on the First Amendment and how it is being distorted as we watch. If we are to learn from history, we must not forget what our founders intended when they gave us this liberty. Our first speaker is one of the founding fathers, portrayed by John Price, who worked in private public communications for over 30 years. Benjamin Franklin is one of the best known of our founding fathers. Franklin, who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, will speak about the original intent of the First Amendment. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the voice of the original intent, Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin Franklin.
Well, I must say that I knew Thomas Jefferson, and I know Thomas Jefferson. But I will speak of him tonight in reverential terms, I suppose, because he was one of our most gifted founding fathers. You know, when one endeavors to grasp where it is one truly wants to go, it is perhaps wise to look back and see where one has been. To that purpose, I have been summoned from the 18th century to be with you this evening. I am told that the question before you in the 21st century is, do you desire to preserve what is left today of the vision and original intent of our founding, or do you wish to allow the leaders of your country, our country, to discard the values that I and the other founders stood for and go in another direction. To remind ourselves of the original vision for the United States, let us recall a few famous words from one of the documents of my time, the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was the mind of America at its formation, speaking to the world to make it abundantly clear why we had chosen to form our own nation. We clearly believe that our most basic rights do come from God. And yet most, if not all, of the governments that have ever existed have, at one time or another, taken one or more of these rights away from its citizens. And that includes, I am sorry to say, the United States. 11 years after we adopted the Declaration, we met during the summer of 1787 to work on devising a new Constitution. One of my ideas was that we needed to ensure that our elected leaders would be persons of virtue. And to that end, I cautioned my fellow members of the Constitutional Convention against offering these leaders large salaries. Well, I see how that worked out. In a speech before the Constitutional Convention, I warned of two forces that seemed to be great motivators of men: avarice and ambition. And that's a reason why I thought that people of virtue, rather than those motivated by money, should assume office. And along these same lines, I also told Congress this. I said, there is scarce one king in 100 who would not, if he could, follow the example of Pharaoh and first take all of the people's land and then all of their money and then make them and their children slaves forever. It was our purpose to construct a government that would attract people of virtue. And we knew that to have a population of virtuous citizens, we had to have a strong moral foundation. And of course, it is religion that provides that. And yet, even when we finished work on the Constitution, I feared that we would devolve into a monarchy. I recall that September day when I walked out of the State House in Philadelphia. You call it Independence Hall today. And I encountered Mrs. Powell on the street, who asked me, well, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic? I said, madam, you have a republic if you can keep it. And I wonder if we have kept it. In adopting the Constitution, we had created a much stronger federal government than the one we had under the Articles of Confederation, and that raised fears in the states that their powers would be usurped by this new central government. And so the states demanded that certain rights be clearly stated, and as a matter of fact, they never would have adopted the Constitution had not assurances been made that certain further restrictions on the federal government would be issued very shortly thereafter. And so we submitted to them 12 amendments. They adopted 10. Those became known as the Bill of Rights. And the very first right articulated in the very first amendment was freedom of religion. It was first for a reason. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now you notice it talks about Congress. It doesn't say anything about the states. You may or may not know that at that time, at least 7 of our states actually had officially sponsored religions. And at least 2 of those 7 continued the practice well into the 19th century. So it is clear that what we did not want was the federal government meddling in religious affairs of the states. or creating a national religion that everyone would be forced to join. Now, at the same time that we were working on the Constitution, we were also meeting to devise something for to take care of the expansion of the Republic into the territories of the Great Lakes region, including what is now the state of Ohio. And what we eventually approved was something called the Northwest Ordinance, drafted by Mr. Jefferson, and because we desired to perpetuate the idea that only through a solid moral foundation could we continue to have good government as our nation expanded, the Northwest Ordinance included language encouraging schools in Ohio and in the rest of the region to teach religion and morals in addition to imparting traditional general knowledge. Now, I mentioned that Thomas Jefferson drafted that law in order to lay a foundation, because years later, when he became president, Mr. Jefferson received a letter from a Baptist group in Connecticut. The Baptists were a minority in that state, and they were worried that their right to worship as they saw fit might be taken away by those in the majority, those in power. And in his reply, Mr. Jefferson used the phrase wall of separation to describe the protection the Baptists had from government intervention in their affairs. Now, I ask you, how could a man who wrote the Northwest Ordinance encouraging schools to teach religion, a man who praised the idea of using a courthouse located near his home for religious services by 4 denominations that lacked churches of their own, a man who regularly attended services at the Capitol, including one 2 days after he wrote back to the Baptists, how could that man's words be twisted decades later to mean that religion must be banned from the public square or from our schools? But I discover today that we have had Supreme Courts that have misapplied Mr. Jefferson's wall of separation metaphor in order to legislate from the bench and stand the First Amendment on its head. I discover that in recent weeks, Congress has been completely bypassed, and that executive fiat has been employed to interfere with people's religious beliefs in blatant contravention of the original intent of the First Amendment. In a moment, I'm sure Mr. McFarland will address all of this in greater detail. But before yielding the floor, I would remind you that I, together with all the other founders, believed most fervently that an educated citizenry is essential to the survival of a free nation. And yet, it isn't enough to be just educated in order to keep yourselves free. You must exercise that other First Amendment right, freedom of speech. Because if you fail to speak out, your knowledge goes for naught. Or, as Pope Boniface VIII put it long ago in the 13th century, qui tacet consentire videtur. Silence gives consent. Thank you for your time.